Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is me. This is going to be a pretty short episode because, as you know, if you've been listening to the intros of the previous episodes or have been reading my weekly email newsletter, I've decided to take most of December off. For a while, I've been considering options for reducing the time I spend on the podcast, including taking a week a month off, which felt awkward, or putting out a new episode every 10 days rather than 7, which felt like it would be confusing for listeners, not to mention me. But then I was having a post-interview chat with Polly Campbell, who was my guest on episode 315, Reigniting Your Creativity with Writing Contests, and who is also the host of the Simply Write with Polly Campbell podcast. In fact, I joined her on her podcast in November to talk about creative control for indie authors. And she mentioned that she was going to be taking a month off, and I thought, what a good idea. So I hope I don't jinx myself by saying this, but one of my primary goals for taking a break is to give myself some time to focus on fiction. Between my nonfiction work, both books and articles, and my speaking engagements, my work with the Alliance of Independent Authors, and my consulting, fiction is the thing that keeps getting pushed to the back burner. And I have been so close to finishing book 6 of the Lizzy Ballard Thrillers for so long, and I hope to have some concentrated writing time so that I can wrap that up. And I also have 2 nearly ready standalones, and I would love to get those into readers' hands next year. Not to mention book 7 of the Ann Kinnear series, which I have a high-level outline for. At least I finally got the last stories I needed for my long-planned Ann Kinnear Suspense short collection, A Year of Kinnear. I realized how long that would have been a work in progress when Mark Lefebvre and I were working on the second edition of Taking the Short Tack, the first edition of which came out in 2020 and contained a reference to a planned collection. And Mark said, well, surely you've published that by now, right? Which was enough to light a fire under me and get me to write the 3 remaining stories I needed: the October story, More Than a Jest, the November story, Ever Thanks, and the December story, Wondering Eyes, all of which are available over at Curios.com. In fact, as a side note, I'm considering taking the shorts down from all the other retailers so that they are available only on Curios, where I get 100% of the list price versus as little as a third of the list price on some of the other sites like Amazon. So assembling the collection is going to be another thing I'll do during my break from the podcast. I'm also hard at work putting a plan together for a new consulting offering, and so I'll be sharing more about that in upcoming episodes. And in preparation for that, I am once again vowing to spend more time on LinkedIn. I realized that it was not fair to pop into LinkedIn, scroll through a few posts, and decide that it's not worth my time. No social media platform is worth a writer's time if they don't curate the feed. So I am liking and, more importantly, commenting on the posts that are tied to my goals for the platform, which are to connect with fellow professionals in the writing and publishing space. And just as a side note, if you're on LinkedIn and your profile picture is more than 10 years old, it is time to update it. In fact, if your profile picture is more than 3 years old, I'd say it's time to update it, but LinkedIn is far and away the worst platform for displaying ridiculously old profile pictures. I'm probably not going to get through all that work in 1 month, just with the time I save from podcast production, but I do hope that I'll at least have some time to regroup, to start that work, and to have a plan in place for going into 2026 for how I will make more time for my fiction. Another change I am going to experiment with is ads. I have been resisting including ads in the podcast for years, but I finally decided I needed to give it a try, in part because I started thinking about my own podcast listening experience. And I realized that almost all the podcasts I listen to include ads. And even though I don't love them, I don't find them particularly distracting. And finding ways to make the podcast more of an income earner helps me justify the time I spend on it. And so I'm going to experiment with just 1 ad at the beginning of the episode and 1 at the end. And I am hoping that that won't be too disruptive. So why did I pick December to take off? One reason was that I really needed a break and December was coming up. But another is that podcast listening generally takes a dip in December anyway, with a lot of us distracted by holiday events and family get-togethers and other year-end celebrations. If I was planning further ahead, and if I was planning on taking a month off based solely on my own schedule, I probably wouldn't pick December. I might pick September, when Wade and I spend 2 weeks on Mount Desert Island, Maine. But September feels like a time when writers are really gearing up, maybe for going back to school or getting kids ready to go back to school or getting ready to dive into that 4th quarter crunch to meet your year's goals. And I didn't want to skip the podcast during that time when you might be especially relying on my guests' expertise. Or I might have picked November, when for the last several years I have been in Las Vegas for a week for Author Nation and have then spent a week recovering from that experience. And speaking of Author Nation, I wanted to take a moment to thank all of the folks who took a minute to let me know that you value the Indie Author Podcast. Podcasters can check stats that suggest how many people are downloading an episode, but there is really nothing like hearing it from an actual listener, so thank you. And while I was in Vegas, I got to catch up not only with podcast listeners, but also with past guests of the Indie Author Podcast and the Self-Publishing with Ally podcast. And that included, here's the list, Alexa Big Wharf, Becca Syme, Shel Honecker, Cindy Gunderson, Dale L. Roberts. I can't believe that this was the first time I met up with Dale in person. Damon Courtney, Dan Wood, David Birgutz, Douglas Platt, Evan Gow, Greg Keogh, Jamie Albright, Jesse Quack, Jim Azevedo, Joanna Penn, Joe Solari, Johnny B. Truant, J.P. Rhineflesh the Ninth, Karen Inglis, Carrie Flanagan, Kevin Tomlinson, Kristen Tate, I'm almost through the list, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, Michael Evans, Orna Ross, Phil Marshall, Ricardo Fayette, Roland Denzel, Sasha Black, Sarah Rosette, and Troy Lambert. And last but not least, Wade Walton, who is not only my husband, but was also brave enough to be my guest on episode 2 to discuss creativity tips. I had a goal of taking a selfie with every past guest who was at the conference. Actually, I'm terrible at selfies, so it was usually the other person who took the picture. And I am still posting those on the Indie Author Facebook page, which links to that guest's episodes. And when I look through that photo album, I am so thrilled to have had a chance to talk with all these knowledgeable and generous guests. And I also realized that I had become aware of most of these people by hearing them speak on other podcasts or at author events like Author Nation, or by having them be recommended by other guests. And I found that that is really the best way to find guests who will be a great match for the show. I fortunately have had only a very, very few guests that afterwards I felt were not a great match, and most of those were ones I accepted through a cold call pitch or from a pitch from a PR firm. So at least through 2026, I'm going to be focusing on inviting back past guests who I feel have brought especially great value to you, or who I know have brought great value because I've heard from you through your comments on that episode. And if there's a past guest that you would especially like me to have back, please drop me a note at Matty@mattydalrymple.com to let me know. A lesson I was reminded of as I was prepping the script for this episode is the power of writing things down. I wrote the original version of this script weeks ago, but I found myself returning to it frequently to modify it in response to changes in my plans, and I don't think I would have thought those plans through in quite as much detail if I hadn't been writing them down. And plus, I'm sharing them with all of you, so that provides accountability. So be sure to take advantage of this dynamic yourself. In the couple of hours when you would otherwise be listening to episodes of the podcast in December, set up some time, either in person or virtually, to get together with a fellow writer and talk through your plans for the coming year, or quarter, or month, or even week, whatever time frame makes sense for you. And having the time to do that as the year is coming to a close is a real gift. So I kind of like the idea of having this year-end regrouping period for myself and for you. I might make the December break a regular part of the podcast schedule. But I also wanted to remind you that my holiday break does not mean a lack of insights from the expert guests of the Indie Author Podcast. You now have 315 backlist episodes to re-listen to, most of whose content is just as valid today as it was when my guests and I first chatted. For example, if you are looking for an overview of indie publishing, you can check out the series of interviews I did with Orna Ross of the Alliance of Independent Authors on the 7 processes of publishing. And conveniently enough, those were episodes 101 through 107. And in December, you can also check out me and some of my other Ally team members hosting episodes of the Self-Publishing with Ally podcast. And in fact, the November 30th episode is me talking with Ally Awards and story marketing advisor Hannah Jacobson about how indie authors can find and make the most of book awards. And you can just search for Self-Publishing with Ally podcast, and that's Ally with an I, A-L-L-I, to find that and many more episodes. And back to the Indie Author Podcast, if you're a writer or a reader of crime fiction, check out my unofficial mini-series, Mistakes Crime Writers Make and How to Avoid Them, which includes episodes on police procedure, firearms, forensic psychology, forensic psychiatry, working canines, bladed weapons, coroners, first responders, the FBI, and PIs. And you'll find a rundown of those at theindieauthor.com/podcast. And if you go to my YouTube channel, you'll also find playlists that can serve as mini and sometimes not so many courses on author career development and branding, succeeding as an author speaker, short fiction, podcasting for authors, my Tools Cruise series with demos of tools and apps to support your writing and publishing work, and my What I Learned video series, where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. What did they learn from that book that they would like to share with their fellow writers? And what did they learn that they would like to share with their fellow readers? So this month's recommended resource is The Indie Author, and all the resources available not only on the podcast and on YouTube, but also on my website, which Writer's Digest has named one of the 101 best websites for writers 4 years in a row. And one final note, in January, the price of my consulting services will be going up. Chart Your Course, which is a tailored consulting service designed to help authors gain clarity on their creative and business goals and craft strategic and tactical plans to reach them, will be going up from $175 for the first hour and $125 for each subsequent 1-hour session to $195 for the first session and $145 for each subsequent session. But if you book your first session before December 31st, 2025, you'll lock in the 2025 price not only for the first session, but for all subsequent sessions. And you just have to book the session before December 31st. The session itself can take place after January 1st, if that works better for you. And similarly, the price for my PodPro author coaching service, which prepares you for successful podcast guest appearances, will go up from $125 to $145. But here too, you'll enjoy the 2025 rate if you book before December 31st, even if that session happens after. And if you would like to send me a holiday present, please take a moment to leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform to help other writers who are looking for support in their writing craft and publishing voyage find it. Or consider buying me, let's say, a mulled cider via Buy Me a Coffee. And you'll find a link to that at the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com. When the podcast resumes on January 6, 2026, I will be speaking with Laura Good about the importance of self-advocacy, and that is an episode that you won't want to miss. Laura is a writer with an MFA from Columbia University, a poet, a film producer, a writer of nonfiction that has appeared in BuzzFeed, New Republic, New York Magazine, and elsewhere, and she teaches at Stanford University, where she was honored with the 2025 Walter J. Coors Award, which is Stanford's highest award for excellence in teaching. She was recommended to me as a guest by the wonderful Jeff Elkins, the dialogue doctor, and his recommendations are always top-notch. I am looking forward to re-listening to that conversation, and I know you'll enjoy it as well. If you'd like to revisit any of the information that I've shared in this episode, a full transcript, not just a summary, is available at theindyauthor.com. So until next time, here's wishing you a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to being back with you in January.